Hello, and welcome to EPR with your favorite environmental nerds, Nic and Laura. On today's episode, Nic and I discuss integrating a planner into your daily routine. We talk to Dr. Ryan Emanuel about hydrology, the Lumbee Tribe and Kombucha. And finally, there can be rivers and lakes in the ocean. Underwater lakes and rivers form on the bottom of the ocean when seawater seeps up from the seafloor, dissolves the saltwater layer around it, and collects in the resulting depressions. Incredibly, these underwater lakes and rivers have shoreline surfaces and even waves.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I saw this like on TV once and I'm like, what is happening right now? So it's water in water. So it's like a underwater wave is the weirdest. Like they have shores and like the water will lap up on shores, even though it's in water already. It's the weirdest thing in the world. So
that is interesting. And I love that you saw it on TV one time.
Yeah. The PVD is a thing where,
hit that music.
NAEP is still accepting abstracts for the 2023 Annual Conference and Training Symposium in Phoenix, Arizona from May 7th to 10th, 2023. Showcase your work to an audience of national and Arizona environmental professionals at its 2023 conference. Abstracts can be submitted for oral presentations, posters, workshops, and special sessions of national and Arizona concern. Please check this out at www.naep.org. We appreciate all of our sponsors, and they are what keep the show going. If you'd like to sponsor the show, please head on over to www.environmentalprofessionalsradio.com and check out the sponsor form for details. Let's get to our segment. But actually, I got your planner in the mail, so thank you for sending that. I am officially going to start using it the coming week because I wanted
after
to get
the birthday weekend.
Yeah. And there's a few other things going on too. So I want to get this done and give it the proper respect it deserves. So
yes, it does take a lot of people get it and they don't put any, like you need like an hour at least to delve into it and get started. Otherwise, it's just going to stare at you.
Right. And that's so, okay. Well, I mean, that's kind of what I want to ask about. What are some tips? Like when you have a planner, right? When you're working with something like that, like you're trying to be better at, attacking the day, so to speak, and you want to use a planner for that. What are some actual tips that you would give just off the bat, like for anyone trying to do any kind of planning? You mentioned doing things the day before, which I think is a really good idea because the first thing in the morning I get is phone calls. I got woken up by a phone call today. So
yes.
What other advice do you have on?
Yeah, definitely. The first one is planning the day before. It can change in the morning, but at least you have something that you're like, okay, I can start here. I mean, the other thing is really like if you're using a planner, is it the right one for you? Someone may have given it to you. So you may have just picked one off the shelf because you're like, oh, I need a planner. But not all planners are built the same and not everybody's brains work the same. So you really have to figure out what works for you. The one I've designed is the process that works for me. And I assume there's a handful of other people out there who it will work for them too, right? So the other ones that specific people have designed, same thing. They have built something that works for them. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Your best friend could be like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And you're like, I don't understand it. So, try different ones out. Try what works for you and stick to whatever that is. But that's the other thing is sticking with it. It's a habit. Yeah. It's not something I think people think like, oh, I'm going to start writing my stuff down and all of a sudden I'm going to have magical results. It's habits. You have to keep working at it. You still have to put the energy and effort into it.
So it's kind of like starting a routine at the gym is what you're telling me?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's is my biggest fear with planners. And I think maybe I just haven't found the right one yet is that's what happens. Like I'm really great at it for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even a little longer. And then it just, gets very busy. And I'm like, I didn't do it this day. I'll do it tomorrow. And that's how it starts with my ADD brain, for example.
And that's why you have to stick to the habit because, and I have this stepwise process for making something a habit. The first thing you do is a thing. I picked up a planner and I'm doing a thing and it's not tied to anything. It's loosey-goosey out there. The next step is making it part of a system. So it's something you already do, like brushing your teeth. Typically, brushing your teeth is something you do after you wake up, after you take a shower, like everyone has a different way, but you do it in some sort of order because it just, I just do it. You don't have to think about when do I brush my teeth. So the planner has to be the same thing. You have to I do my planner at the end of the day before I close out and go home every day.
Yeah.
If you start falling off of that, out it goes.
Right.
The one time that you forget to brush your teeth is because your routine changed. Something happened. And so to make it stick, you've got to pull it in and integrate it with something else. So if it's, 5:30, set an alarm on your phone. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's, before I check out of the office, whatever it is, you got to tie it to something.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And that's kind of like one of the core concepts for someone, so I do have like the ADD brain, like I really genuinely have it. And one of the core concepts for me is routine. Like routine is extremely important. And so like just even how I make coffee every morning, I don't forget how to make coffee because I do it the same way. I'm like, I wake up, I go downstairs, I do it. That's like the first thing I do because it's kind of like excited. I'm like, oh, and then I do my next task because by the time I'm done with that, then the coffee's gonna be done and I can drink coffee and start work. And that's the kind of stuff that I basically trick my brain into doing. And so I see where you're coming from there.
Right. So if there's something you already do daily, tie it to that. So if it's making your coffee, read through your planner, whatever you wrote for you the night before while you're making the coffee.
Yeah.
Or once coffee's finished, sit down. I'm going to drink my coffee. The first sips of my coffee are with my planner. Something like that.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. Wow. And I'll have to report back how I do. But I always love the idea because it's good to be organized. And even when you have a process, you have a way of doing things, there's always ways that you can be better. And I could say, I don't think I'm disorganized, but I can always be a little bit more organized, especially when it's a busy time of year like it is right now for me. For those that work on the federal calendar, this is probably the busiest time of year. And it's when you need it the most. And it's also when it's the hardest to do. So it's kind of a really interesting juxtaposition. I wanted to start it last week. I wanted to bring it up last week, but I was working so hard. I was like, I can't take a minute. I can't.
It's really good to start when you have the time. Because it's like anything else. If you decided tomorrow that you want to learn how to play the piano, starting that is not going to be the best time. Is not going to be when you're in the throes of 1,000 other things, right. Because you want to get to the point with like running or something where it's so much of a habit that you miss it when you're not doing it. Yeah. So like for me, writing this planner every single day, a day I miss it. I skipped one of the monthly worksheets once and I was like, oh my God. Like it felt like, for me, it was more like OCD. I got to go back and fill that out, even though that was 3 months ago.
Funny. Oh, that's funny. Yeah. That's good. I like that. And yeah, like I say, it's sometimes people like, when you commute, we used to, well, I guess not everybody commutes anymore, but that was one where if you're taking public transit, right? It's a great example, a great time to use to plan your rest of your day, making lists or doing planners or whatever it is. So yeah, that was something that I liked doing back in the day. Over 100 years ago when I was working at an office. Yeah, that was I like doing that. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm excited to try it. Yeah,
well, I'm excited to see how it works out for you.
All right, cool. Let's get to our interview.
Sounds good.
Hello and welcome back to EPR. Today we have Dr. Ryan Emanuel on the show. Ryan is an associate professor in the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University and was formerly a professor in the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. He is a hydrologist who also studies environmental justice and indigenous rights in North Carolina. And he is an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks. Happy to be here. So
in your bio, you said that you were proselytized into hydrology, and I'm really glad I said that word right, which does really conjure up quite an image in my head. It was a pretty great story. Can you tell us how you got into hydrology then?
Yeah, I'm happy that you brought that up. And it is an entertaining and weird and interesting story. So when I was finishing my senior year of high school, I was kind of debating what I wanted to do with my life, or at least with the summer before I went to college. And sometime in the spring, a man knocked on my door one Sunday afternoon, and he literally said, "Do you want to be a hydrologist?" Turns out this man was the office chief for the Western North Carolina field headquarters of the U.S. Geological Survey. And on the side, he managed rental properties. One of the rental properties that he managed was in my neighborhood. And he happened to read about me in the newspaper back when newspapers used to publish lists of scholars at different high schools, and they would give your parents' names and your home address and all this personal information.
Wow.
So he recognized the address as a street where he managed a rental house. He was looking for some help for the summer, and he thought he would come pay me a visit. And he did. And I had no idea what hydrology was other than the literal translation of water science.
Right.
And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. And so the Monday after I graduated from high school, I was being sworn in as a federal employee, and immediately got to work washing bottles, learning how to stream gauge, collecting data and QA, QC, and all of this stuff. And the rest is history.
Oh, that's amazing. So you did that for your whole summer, just for the summer? Or did you get to do it throughout college too?
I came back and worked in the same office for 3 summers. So I had a lot of experience in that particular office. And then I spent a semester during my undergraduate years working in the North Carolina district headquarters, and I think is now something like the South Atlantic Water Science Center in Raleigh, working for the Lakes and Estuaries unit, doing calibration of water quality instruments and assimilating data into the USGS database before all of that stuff was automated. So lots of different stuff.
Yeah, you've seen quite a few changes, I guess, in the hydrology world as a result. I guess how has data kind of influenced the way we do research in this field?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So because I started out my career working with the USGS, I learned the lesson early on that in water science, high quality data is of utmost importance, right? And of course, I've learned since then that lots of other things are terribly important as well. But that USGS ethic of we're going to collect the highest quality data possible and pour all of our resources into excellent data collection and stewardship, that has stuck with me. And so I continue to use USGS data. I have throughout my career in various ways. I use it in the classroom to teach students just the basics of things like stage discharge relationships for understanding stream flow. But I also use it in my research. We analyze thousands and thousands of records to look for things like trends in stream flow because of climate change or land use change and things like this. But for a lot of hydrologists, these high quality data sets are sort of those are the bedrock of everything that we do.
Yeah, and bedrock is, no pun intended, right? Yeah.
Right.
So you started in geology. You got a geology degree first and then hydrology. Was there a reason behind picking one over the other initially? I know they work kind of well together, but why geology first?
When I was an undergraduate, I think the University of Arizona was the only institution in the U.S. that offered a degree in hydrology. So most of the hydrologists from my era hold degrees in something else. So geology was the closest thing at my institution to water science. In fact, my undergraduate mentor was a groundwater hydrologist, and he was based in the geology department. So it was basically a choice for me between geology or biology. And where I went to school at Duke, most of the biology students were pre-med. And so it was not a good fit for me. But, in graduate school, I moved into an environmental sciences department. At the University of Virginia, the environmental sciences comprise hydrology, geoscience, ecology, and atmospheric science. And so that appealed to me because while it wasn't a formal concentration in hydrology, hydrology was a focal area within the department. And I didn't have to go all the way to Arizona to get a degree called hydrology.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's served you pretty well, obviously. So you've been in academia for quite some time. Is that the direction you thought you would go when you started college?
Not when I started college. I had very little direction when I started, other than knowing I wanted to do something related to science. I did not see a lot of role models other than the folks that I worked with at the USGS. So I was imprinted early on with the hydrology bug. Not only was I interested in science, but I wanted to do something that got me outdoors. I did not want to work in a laboratory because I knew myself well enough to know that would not be a good fit. And indeed, when I took organic chemistry. I ended up going to the hospital and getting stitches.
Oh, wait, what?
We don't have time for that story here, but I always knew that I wanted to be out in the field. And so from the get-go, my experience in hydrology taught me that, this is a place where you can go out and work in the field, but you also can do some computational work and sort of exercise both of those interests.
Yeah. And, working for the Nicholas School of the Environment, it's one of the most prestigious environmental schools in the country. So what are you working on and what do you like about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm really excited about being in the Nicholas School because it's a place to cultivate diverse interests that I have. I'm still really interested in basic questions in hydrologic science. So right now, my group is using stable isotopes of water to look at patterns of water storage inside of trees. We know that trees store lots of water, and that has implications for the water cycle in various places and at different times. But a lot of numerical and conceptual models treat that water in the tree sort of as a black box. And so we're trying to unpack the black box and understand how long water spends in different tree tissues at different times of the year, and what are the implications not only for tree health, but also for evapotranspiration and the broader water cycle. So that's one of the newer projects that I'm working on at Duke. And that's in the side of my work that kind of lives in the Duke River Center, which is a laboratory facility that I share with other faculty members in the Nicholas School and in the Department of Biology. But the cool thing about Duke is that I'm also able to work on some of the other issues that are really important to me. I'm interested in questions around environmental justice and Indigenous rights and how they intersect in places like Eastern North Carolina, where we have large American Indian populations and a lot of issues related to pollution and environmental degradation.
But you were talking about your work with social justice and the tribes, and you're a member of the Lumbee Tribe, which shares a name with the Lumbee River in North Carolina. How has that shaped your career?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. One of the things that I heard throughout my childhood and youth, and I know people who come from tight-knit communities hear this as well, but in the Lumbee community, there's a strong ethic of your purpose is to go off and get a good education so that you can come back and help your people. And so my educational path and my career path, while they might not have been wholly shaped by that ethic, they were certainly informed by that ethic. And so when I thought about pursuing an academic career, one of the considerations that I had to make was, how is this going to help Lumbee people? How is it going to help other tribal nations, other Indigenous peoples? And so I would say that perhaps above anything else has sort of influenced my decisions around what I study, what kind of career I pursued, and sort of how I envision the impact of my work.
Awesome. And we were talking before we started about your involvement with the tribe, and how far does your involvement go with the tribe? Do you sit on an advisory committee or anything like that?
Right now, today, I don't have any formal responsibilities in the Lumbee Tribe. The tribe has a constitutionally organized government, and there are sort of three branches of government modeled after the ones that we're all familiar with. And so I have no formal role. I'm not a tribal leader. I'm not elected to any office, but I am called on occasionally by people who are in those roles if they have questions about specific environmental issues, pollution, climate change, development, things like this. I do get called on regularly to answer these kinds of questions. And I think that one of my duties as a Lumbee citizen is to be as responsive as possible. And so I do try to make myself available to answer, to meet with tribal leaders and with community members, and to discuss the questions that they have. And I can't always offer answers because I'll just be honest with you, like rarely do the questions focus on the exact topics that I study, right? I don't think I've never had a question to date that focuses on tree water storage or evapotranspiration. But I think one of the privileges of being in academia is that, one, I have the freedom to move into those areas if I can make scholarly connections to my work. But also I'm around so many people who work on these topics that it's really easy for me to say, you know what, I know somebody who works on that, and I think they may have the answer to this question. And so those are fun conversations because I want to know the answer to that question as well. And being in a place like Duke and formerly at a place like NC State, I had access to people who knew a lot about a lot of these different topics. And so that was really rewarding for me. And I hope that it was sort of a bridge. And that's one way that I see myself today, as sort of a bridge between all of these resources that the university has and some of the needs that our tribal communities have.
That's nice. That's great that you can do that. You mentioned too before that you didn't really have role models in the space when you were looking to get into this so much. How does that impact how you operate?
Yeah. So today I'm cognizant of my own experience, and I work with groups like the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, which is a national group, on mentoring programs specifically for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous students who want to pursue careers in sciences or even who want to go into academia. So we have programs that are dedicated to mentoring in those spaces. And so I participate in those. And then we also do things at Duke, like bring high school students up to visit during the summer and show them what it looks like to be a hydrologist or an environmental scientist, just so that students know that these careers are available and there's something out there besides being a physician or being an attorney. These are incredibly important careers, right? We need lots of physicians and attorneys, but we also need environmental scientists.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. And we also need people doing environmental justice work, and you're doing that too. So can you talk a little bit about what you do in that area?
Yeah. So several years ago, the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, which is a statewide body made up of representatives from all of the tribes in North Carolina, as well as some other Indigenous organizations, formed an environmental justice committee. And they invited me to come alongside and advise that committee. I'm not on the commission. Again, it's made up of elected tribal leaders and other officials, but they also have the ability to pull in outside experts. And so they invited me to come alongside. And together we learned about environmental justice principles and concepts. And we even had opportunities to speak into specific issues, large environmental impact statements that had implications for tribes, to point out things like procedural injustices, which are really important in Indian country. A lot of tribes have statutory rights to consultation with the federal government, but state recognized tribes and tribes like the Lumbee that are governed by 1950s era federal legislation, they don't have those statutory rights. And so it's important to remind and re-remind decision makers that even though there's no legal obligation for you to engage with these tribes in the decision-making process, it's still incredibly important. And these are all the reasons why. And so a lot of my environmental justice work is kind of laying out the reasons why and thinking about ways to get over the barriers of what happens when tribes are not engaged in these important decisions about their lands and waters and communities.
Yeah. I think that's important. It's interesting, as we were talking about the naming of the Lumbee River and where it started, and it's almost like that was the 1800s version of now.
Oh, yes.
Where, it's like where we're trying to figure out like, what is the real story and how do we be inclusive? But it just it's the same, still the same problem.
Yeah. And a lot of the issues that we commonly classify as environmental justice issues, and if we want to unpack that, it's sort of the racial and socioeconomic disparities in the distribution of pollution, environmental harms, but also in the distribution of amenities like urban green space and things like this. So these issues are tightly coupled to a long chain of historical processes that at some point in the not too distant past are bound up with issues of institutionalized racial discrimination, genocide against Indigenous peoples, and lots of other practices that are oppressive and marginalizing for people. So even though we aspire to do better, we still have to reckon with the fact that a lot of the ways that hazards are distributed today are kind of based on these very racist principles that were applied for a long time.
Right. Well, thank you for doing that work. And you've won some awards for doing that type of work, including 2019, the Steve Wing International Environmental Justice Award. Are there any others that stand out as ones that you're pretty proud of?
Oh, thanks for that. I was excited to also get an award from the United Tribes of North Carolina, which is it's an organization of all the tribes for service to Indian education. Because I'm an educator, first and foremost, a lot of the framing for my work is around education. So while I do research on environmental justice and I do advocacy work around environmental justice, I mean, you could categorize a lot of what I do is education, formal and informal education, because a lot of the communities that I work with, whether they're Lumbee communities or other tribal communities or non-Indigenous communities, they know that something is wrong, but they don't have the policy language or the lingo or they don't speak the regulatory speak. And so a lot of my work is education around that. Yes, this is a real experience. We all know this, but these are policy tools that are designed to step into that space and to assist and to help you articulate your concerns in ways that regulators and bureaucrats can understand. So I was happy about that award. And then 2 years ago, I spent the year at the National Humanities Center, which was an amazing, incredible experience, even though it was mostly virtual. It was a sabbatical fellowship where I had the freedom to work on a book-length project on environmental justice and Indigenous rights in Eastern North Carolina.
Cool.
That's really cool. And I guess, are there challenges with doing that? I imagine it's not as simple as just walking up to, someone in Congress and being like, hey, this is what you should be doing. And then you're done, right? It's got to be a little more challenging than that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I come from a natural science background, I walked into this completely naive, thinking that, that's what we do. We identify the problem. I did this numerical analysis. It shows the disparity exists. Here you go, fix it. And,
right.
The actual problems come into play when you have to decide among all of these competing factors, right, for making decisions. Making decisions, unfortunately, it doesn't solely boil down to questions of equity. We all know this. And so I spend now a lot of time kind of thinking about what kind of communication efforts have to accompany the data analysis and all of these other kind of wonky things. So I won't say that I'm good at it, but I do read in this area and I look at people who are doing work in related areas like climate communication. There's very important scholarship that's happening in there about ways people behave and altering our behavior and things like that. So I'm cognizant of all of that.
Well, that's awesome. It's really great to have you doing that kind of work. We're going to switch gears a little bit, though, and ask you about you and things you do for fun. So you have a hobby that is different than ones we've had on before, which is great. That's why we love asking this question. You make kombucha. So I'm curious when you started doing that. I know you've been up to lots and lots of it so far. And then when did you receive your first kombucha baby? And I forget what that thing is called.
Yes, I am a kombucha aficionado. And the backstory is that years and years ago, I had a soft drink addiction and then I cut it cold turkey. And several years ago, I learned that there was this effervescent drink. It didn't have high fructose corn syrup in it, and it purportedly had some health benefits. I just like the taste of it. I don't really know anything about the purported health benefits. Okay. But several years ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a postdoc at NC State gave me my first SCOBY and sent me some directions on an internet website about how to brew kombucha. And so I started then, and it really ramped up during the pandemic, probably around the same time that everyone was making sourdough and all of this stuff. Yeah. In the early days of the pandemic, I decided that kombucha was going to be my thing. And so it continued little by little. I had a little logbook that was it was my pandemic diary. In the early days, I was like, this is for posterity because, it's going to be a global catastrophe and somebody will find this someday. Right. It's kind of a morbid thought. But over time, it morphed into a fairly systematic kombucha recipe log, where I would tweet things and make notes and all of this. And so I really like making kombucha out of locally sourced ingredients. And my friends at the Kohari tribe have given my wife and me tons and tons of elderberries. My wife, bless her, is an awesome cook, and she boiled a bunch of those elderberries down into lots of syrup. And so for a long time, we had elderberry syrup to make kombucha. And then the supply switched from elderberries to muscadine grapes. And we make muscadine grape kombucha. I've even tried making tea with poplar bark, because that's a culturally important medicinal plant, the inner bark of tulip poplar. So I never made the tea strong enough that you could actually taste the difference and say, ooh, this is poplar bark. But I've got some. I will have label bottles sometimes that say this one's poplar bark.
Right. Never the world ends, you will still have your recipe book for others to find. I love that.
That's right. And I'm closing in on 1,000 pints bottled so far.
Wow, that's really impressive. That's pretty cool.
Well, you have to you got to keep it going, right? Because you have to.
Now you do.
I don't know how it works exactly, but
if you want to save the scobies, you just got to keep making it. It's like sourdough, and the scobies keep multiplying. So I'm always looking for people to gift scobies to, or they go in the compost.
There we go. Now, you mentioned that you worked at NC State and then Duke. So this is the most important question in the interview. Who do you root for during basketball season? Where do your loyalties lie here?
That's an easy question. I did my undergraduate at Duke. So I am Duke Blue through and through.
Oh, man. So you worked at NC State as a Blue Devil?
I did, yes.
Oh, man, that's awesome. Gosh, this is basketball country. So that's a dangerous game you played.
It is. And now I've got a kid in school at Chapel Hill. So I have sort of peripheral ties to the 3 ACC schools in the Triangle.
Oh, that's great, man. Yeah. And the last tournament, the last game, Coach K, man, what a way to go.
Well, you also have some pretty important events coming up in the next couple of weeks that commemorate the environmental justice movement in Warren County. So do you want to tell us about some of those?
Yeah. So I don't know if your subscribers and listeners all know this, but the modern environmental justice movement has a birthplace in Eastern North Carolina, in Warren County. And it was some events back in the late 1970s and early 1980s that culminated in the creation of a landfill to dispose of PCB contaminated soils in the predominantly African American community of Afton, which is outside of Warrenton, North Carolina. And September 17th, 2022 will be the major commemoration of the 40th anniversary of protests and social movements that happened near the entrance of this PCB landfill. And so they're gathering people who are part of that movement, and they're inviting the next generation of environmental justice folks to come out. They're going to hold this in Warrenton, in Warren County, North Carolina, on Saturday, the 17th of September.
Oh, that's really cool. Do you have a role there as well? Are you going to be able to go?
I'm planning to attend. I have no formal role in organizing or carrying out the activities. Duke has a commemoration as well. I think it's the Thursday before, on September 15th. Duke Chapel is hosting Reverend Ben Chavis, who was involved in the movement 40 years ago, and Catherine Coleman Flowers, who works on environmental justice and received the MacArthur Genius Award. The two of them will be in conversation at Duke Chapel on the evening of September 15th.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, yeah, I'm glad you get to experience that. And like I say, I think it's good for a lot of people to know that. And more the merrier. I'm assuming the others can go and just show up. So if you are in the area, please do stop by. And it's interesting. Like, I think, we were talking earlier about hydrology and, in plants. And, I've seen this in southern Texas, for example. Like, the mesquite that's there, right, is a very water heavy plant. And when they go through droughts, it's actually a really scary thing, because the stream beds have the most water, and that's where the mesquite go. And then those mesquite take all the water away. So even when rain comes back, the streams are gone. And that really influences communities down there, including low-income minority communities as well. Do you see that in other areas? Is that some of what your research looks at too? Or is it simply like, is it more data intensive?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that phenomenon. I don't think we don't see the same thing in the Southeast because, as you know, the water balance is much different here. But there are all these sort of interactions between people and the water cycle and plants that I would just say I wasn't taught about the human dimensions of these interactions in school. And so when you bring that up, that's a really good example of an important connection between humans and the environment, and specifically between humans and water, that I think we do need more of. And so I try to bring examples like that into teaching now, even in my hydrology class, which nominally doesn't have anything to do with environmental justice. I at least want my students to know that you can't study these things in a vacuum, and it always matters to somebody.
Yeah. So what are the things that you see in the East Coast? Like, what are the issues we see with water?
So because the water balance is much different, our landscape is dominated by wetlands. And because of that, there are major issues with sort of wetland preservation under the Clean Water Act, but also there's a robust wetland mitigation banking system here to compensate for all of the wetlands that are damaged and destroyed through development, road construction, et cetera. And so one of the things that we face in this part of the state is that some of those wetlands have extreme cultural importance to Indigenous peoples. And that cultural importance isn't represented in sort of the system of compensatory mitigation, right? How do you trade cultural values when you're thinking about what we usually call ecosystem services, right? And so one of the challenges in North Carolina is not a physical hydrology or a physical water balance challenge. It's the challenge of educating regulators and decision makers around those cultural aspects of water. And so, just one example to give you from my tribe, the Lumbee River is a blackwater stream. It has these really wide, beautiful, bald cypress dominated floodplain wetlands. And it has a number of tributaries, and the tributaries are these lovely floodplain swamps as well. A number of those swamps have this historical significance to Lumbee communities dating all the way back to the 18th century. But there are some very specific events that happened in the mid-19th century during and after the Civil War with one of our cultural heroes, Henry Berry Lowry. He led resistance against the Confederacy during the Civil War. And then later on, he led a guerrilla war against the Reconstructionist government, who happened to be the same people, just sort of wearing different hats. But Henry Berry Lowry's band was based out of very specific swamps in our territory. And Lowry himself was never captured or killed. And there's an entire history and even mythology around what happened to Lowry. And it's all tied up in these swamps and very specific geographies. And so the preservation of those landscapes and those waterways are incredibly important to Lumbee people for our collective sense of identity. And that sense of identity can be eroded or it can be destroyed, just like wetland acreage can be nibbled away. And we haven't yet figured out a good way to talk about what it looks like or what it means to protect and preserve those spaces in this era of wetland mitigation, where wetlands are interchangeable.
Yeah, wow, that's really incredible story. So
Nick, when I was in North Carolina visiting, I stopped by the History Museum. If you go in there, there's a whole section of the history of North Carolina, and then all that stuff about the Lumbee tribe is there. So reading all this about Ryan, I was like, oh, I'm having flashbacks.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. Do you think it's gotten better over time? Do you think we've gotten better at understanding that there's cultural value to these sites?
We're starting to understand at large that these cultural values exist, where some of the friction and the hard work is today is translating that understanding into actionable policy and regulations. And so that's kind of where we are. we're approaching the same page on understanding that these are important. And now the question is, what do we do?
Yeah. Are you optimistic about the future? How we're going to handle it going forward?
I am. And one of the things that gives me hope is that the Lumbee Tribe has just created a Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources that as that department stands up, I hope they will be able to take responsibility for things like consultation and engagement with state and federal regulators so that there actually is a point person or at least a point office within the tribe for these kinds of things. And I know that in other tribes, these offices and these positions get bogged down with lots and lots of requests.
Yeah.
But I think having a dedicated office and a position for that environmental engagement with decision makers is a critical first step.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I hate to say it, but we're almost out of time. So is there anything else you want to discuss before we let you go?
No, thank you so much for such a wide-ranging conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we let you leave, where can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch?
Well, I'm on Twitter, probably a little more than I should be, but my handle is @waterpotential. And then you can find other contact information and a little more information about me on the lab's website. It's called DukeRiverCenter.org.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here, Ryan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. That's our show. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us today. Please be sure to check us out each and every Friday. While you're at it, subscribe, rate, and review. Bye.
See you, everybody.